stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now.
Thanks, Jerry, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access Television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1418th edition of Motorsports Unlimited. Today's show is titled Explanation 12 and is the 12th episode in our series within Motorsports Unlimited, meant to explain what Motorsports Unlimited is all about and has been all about for the past 30-plus years. In Explanation 11, the last episode in this explanation series within Motorsports Unlimited, we ran out of time while discussing the role our school system plays in developing our self-esteem, a subject I got into while trying to understand why the motorsport community doesn't seem to be demonstrating any anger about the loss of motorsport in America. I want to go into it a little deeper because I think it's important, and while the primary cause of the loss of motorsport in America is our omission from network television sports news, that isn't the only reason. And the school system has played an important role in what has happened, and I want to go into it in depth. And I will. But first, I think it's time for an update on my physical condition. When I began this explanation series, it was intended to let folks know what happened to me and when I'd be up and running again. That was 3 years ago. I'm obviously not up and running. And I realized I haven't provided a physical update in some time. So, here it is. 3 years ago, 2 neurosurgeons removed 4 discs from my lower back and fused 5 lower back vertebrae together. The idea was to make one piece out of the 5 lower back vertebrae. Recovery time was estimated to be between 9 months and 1 year. 8 months into the recovery, the next disc up from the 5 that were fused failed. Now what? The neurosurgeons indicated there were 2 possibilities. First, they could go in and remove the failed disc and fuse another vertebrae. My question was, what keeps that one from failing? To which they responded, you have degenerative disc disease. There is nothing to keep the next one from failing. I didn't like the possibilities. It seemed to me, as we remove each disc and fuse another vertebrae, we just transfer the entire load to the next disc up. There was another possibility. We could take out 2 more discs instead of 1. The advantage being, at this point, we're getting up into an area of the back where we rarely have disc problems. No guarantees, of course, but that's been our experience. The main problem with taking 2 is the extreme loss of flexibility. I really didn't like this thought either, as I live alone and I already have real problems bending over, and even simple things like tying my shoes is a problem right now. It's difficult for me to envision doing something that will give me even less flexibility. I really don't like any of the choices, and at 75 years of age, I may have to accept what I have. Of course, I realize that's not much of a medical update as far as offering when I'll be up and running again, but I guess for the time being, I have to accept the reality that as we age, things happen for which we don't get better. It's a bitter pill to swallow, and I do keep my eyes and ears open for possible solutions that may develop. Until then, I have to work with what I have. Now, I want to get back to the school system and the role I believe it plays in our development. But first, I have to get caught up on some old business. Our regular viewers know that Mr. Lyle, Jerry Lockhart, created a special award to honor Chris Schutz after she passed away in 1996. For those who don't know, Chris was my wife, but she was far more than that. I've said many times there wouldn't be a Motorsports Unlimited if it weren't for Chris. Jerry knew us well enough to know how true these words were. Chris and I had a rare relationship in which we didn't just live together, we worked together, we played together. We were more than just partners, we were true soulmates. When I was racing, she was with me. She didn't know a spark plug from a cylinder head, but she was the only pit crew I ever needed. I didn't need any help with spark plugs and cylinder heads, but I sure needed help with things like logistics, and she was excellent. I often said, Chris was strong where I was weak, and I was strong where she was weak. We were a perfect couple. She could spell anything, and I couldn't even spell the word anything. More important, above all, she was my best friend. She's been gone for more than 20 years, and there still isn't an hour that goes by that I don't think about her. I don't want to belabor the point, but we've been through all this before over the years on Motorsports Unlimited. I remind the audience of this for those who haven't been watching for 30 years and won't know what I'm talking about when I show the winner of the Chris Schutz Award in 2017. You see, Jerry has continued this award all these years and added another one, which I'll explain in a moment. While the show at which the award is given has changed several times over the years, in 2017 it was presented at the Riverside Garage Car Show held in Riverside, Illinois. The Chris Schutz Award was not awarded for any of the traditional show things like best paint or best interior or best engine. Rather, it's awarded to the person whose car I think Chris would have liked best. I should mention Jerry was always interested in the fact that Chris never drove and never had a driver's license. As she used to say, some people should drive and some people shouldn't, and I'm one who shouldn't. On the other hand, she was the world's best spectator. She loved the races and the car shows and often participated in scoring. The car selected at the 2017 Riverside Garage Car Show to receive the Chris Schutz Award was this beautiful Chitty Chitty Bang Bang replica you really have to see in person to appreciate. The creativity and workmanship is first rate, and Chris, who had very few mechanical skills, always admired the work of those who create almost out of nothing automotive artwork. Now, I mentioned earlier, Jerry Larkart added another award when motorsport lost another person who played an important role in creating what we all enjoy today. Tom Lima was an early car show organizer who Jerry felt, like Chris, shouldn't be forgotten. It's true, there are several outdoor summer car shows every weekend these days, but there was a time when there were only a couple all summer. Tom Lima's shows sort of created the format for these outdoor summer car shows. He was the right guy at the right time, and Jerry wanted to make sure Tom, who passed away, wasn't forgotten. So he created the annual Tom Lima Award to be presented at the same time the Chris Schutz Award was presented. In 2017, the Tom Lima Award was won by this outstanding mid-50s Chevy. Like the Chris Schutz Award, the Tom Lima Award is not about a traditional car show category. Rather, it's the car Jerry thinks Tom would have liked best. Over the years, the award has gone to a number of James Dean-style Mercurys and the like. Tom Lima was very old school. Jerry, who knew Tom as well as anyone, knew of his affection for mid-50s Chevys, and this one is an outstanding example. My apologies for not having video of this, but as you know by now, I just can't physically do it. In fact, it's taken close to a year to get these pictures on the air. Oh, speaking of pictures, probably the reason it's taken so long is I was attacked at the show. Two women asked me if I would take a picture with them. Of course, I'm not going to turn a lady down. Then, without warning, I was attacked. As you can see, I was nearly killed. Having reported all that, it brings me to the final piece of 2017 old business. Our regular viewers know that every Thanksgiving morning, Motorsports Unlimited has its camera at the Rock to record anyone who shows up on the anniversary of America's first auto race held right here in Chicago, Thanksgiving Day, 1895. We've been doing this every Thanksgiving morning since 1995, when the 100th anniversary of America's first auto race was celebrated, including the dedication of the Rock, a piece of granite with a bronze plaque identifying it as the location of the start and finish of America's first auto race. Covering this event is a tradition, and we are proud of that, and I sure didn't want to break the tradition after all of these years. Since my latest and most serious back surgery, it has been more than difficult for me physically. Each year I pondered if I should take the chance, and each year I did it. Or should I say I stumbled through it. The last few years, the shows produced were definitely not up to our normal production standards, but at least they were something. Last year, 2017, turned out to be a disaster. Yes, it was a physical struggle. That means I was in a lot of pain. But as I said, the event is important, so we pressed on. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to me, we experienced technical problems of which I wasn't aware until a couple of months later when I started going through the footage to put the show together. The first two interviews were fine. Then, without warning, the camera was recording only black. I still don't understand it. There were no changes made, but all of a sudden, the footage would go black. Then, after several minutes, it would be recording again. I think it may have been too cold for the camera, but the truth is, I really don't know. And I have no explanation for this peculiar malady, but I should have. I've been doing this work for more than 30 years and have never had this kind of problem before. Oh, it's not that we haven't experienced technical problems before, of course we have. But we worked through them, resolved the issue or issues, and continued our work. I don't recall ever losing a show. So, now I found myself with unpredictable footage, impossible to put together in a meaningful way. What to do? Frankly, I haven't done anything. The footage isn't any good. Believe me, editing a show together under good circumstances is a daunting task, but trying to make something out of nothing, or almost nothing, is more than I'm capable. On the other hand, I've been encouraged to air whatever I have because people want to see it. I'm quite torn about this. I'm proud of what I put on the air, and this is not something of which I'm going to be proud. Still, I think I'm going to have to swallow my pride and air what I have. People seem to really want to see it, whatever it is. I can't help but think I'm making a mistake. These past few years have been extremely difficult for me to shoot anything physically, but I was so determined not to break the tradition. I should have known better, and I should have spotted the problem was developing. It's difficult when in constant pain and I'm kicking myself. Regardless, I'm the one responsible. For those whose footage is short, changed, or not at all, you have my apologies. The fault is mine. Now, let's get back to the school system and my assertion the schools failed us, meaning those of us who are part of the motorsport community. In the last episode of this explanation series, that would be the program titled Explanation 11, it sounded like I was trashing Lane Tech High School, while at the same time I went through considerable effort to detail much of what I'd gained at Lane Tech. Sounds like a contradiction, right? It's not. It's quite possible to acknowledge the positive things one has benefited from while still pointing out the negatives. In fact, I think those of us who have experienced this have an obligation to point out the inadequacies of the educational system if it is ever to serve our interests. Further, I think serious educators should listen carefully to what I'm saying. I'll be the first to concede it is difficult to be sensitive to something one doesn't feel themselves. It seems to me those who step forward to be educators of the entire population would be interested to know they might have missed somebody or some group. While I've said many times on Motorsports Unlimited, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't use something I learned at Lane Tech. At the same time, I'm saying they failed me, and people like me. You see, one gets far more out of their school years than reading, writing, and arithmetic. One also develops a sense of where they fit in society. I spent some time on that program, Explanation 11, detailing what I see as a disproportionate emphasis on running, jumping, skipping, and playing in the school system via the attention given to football, baseball, and basketball teams that have become a large part of the school system, and indeed, in many cases, have become the school's identity. I pointed out, typically, the person or persons identified as the big man or men on campus. Oh, we even have an anachronism for it, BMOP. One would think we'd be embarrassed by that, but we're not. Without going through the entire thing again, you really have to watch every episode. I pointed out the advantages those so identified gleaned from their status as the school's star quarterback or pitcher or center. I mentioned the enhanced self-esteem these folks benefit from, both in school and in the community. What I want to talk about now is, at whose expense does their heightened self-esteem come? You see, self-esteem is a comparative thing. It is a measurement of one person or one group's standing in the population. If we identify some as BMOP or big men on campus, at the same time, we are raising their self-esteem over the other students. One doesn't come without the other. It gets even more complicated when the school or school systems benefit financially from the effort or efforts of the school teams. Inevitably, those who are part of those teams will receive favorable treatment. But what I step forward to point out is, it comes at someone's expense. I know it's difficult to imagine considering the so-called educational landscape today, but schools are not in the team business. They're in the education business. And that education business is in which they participate in America is a school system that develops all of its population. One would think educators would be keenly aware of this, yet I see no meaningful evidence of this. In fact, I would suggest they are active participants. Active participants in something I'm sure they are smart enough to perceive. Okay, allow me to give them a little wiggle room. Our educators, like everyone else in our society, is influenced by television. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that they see nothing wrong. Very few among us can shield ourselves from this influence. We, as a society, have boasted about our constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of the press for centuries. Yet, it hasn't been true since 1927. That's right, I said, despite what is written in the Constitution, America hasn't had free press or free speech since 1927. I will concede we didn't know it until 30 years later, but I was certainly aware of it in 1957. That's 30 years later, when I became aware that our racetracks couldn't survive without an equal representation on television as granted to competing entities in the sports entertainment marketplace. I saw it clearly. Television was influencing every part of American life. What I didn't know in 1957 was my community wouldn't be allowed by law to access the public airwaves. Those were lessons I still had to learn. Let me quickly say, the motorsport community isn't the only victim of television's exclusivity and awesome power. But, as I've said before, I'll have to let other victims speak for themselves. I can only speak knowledgeably about what I know. And I know our denial of access to the public airways has all but destroyed us, and the educational system has been part of it. I don't recall any class in school that explained, despite what is written in the Constitution, the device that has become the only meaningful communications medium is available by law only to a privileged few. The consequences will be only those so included can survive. I'll get to all this as we go along, and I've already touched on some of it. As I said, you have to watch every episode. I don't want to go too far down that road right now, but I'll get back to it. I want to talk just a little more about how I think the schools should have been different if they were going to serve the community of which I eventually became part. When I was in high school, I couldn't wait until the school day was over so I could go to my buddy's garage where we were doing an engine swap or building a chassis. This was something in which I was very interested. I must admit, I didn't pay much attention to the students who stayed after school to pursue football or basketball programs. Frankly, I didn't know any of them. Everyone I knew was interested in cars and motorcycles, and the sooner we could get to that, the better. It didn't occur to me then, as it does now, those things should have been part of the school system. I shouldn't have had to flee the school to get to what I was interested in, but I did, as did most of my friends. School should have been the place where we went to pursue these interests, and we should have been rewarded for it. It wasn't like our ambition was to rob banks or cause trouble. We wanted to build engines and understand how to make them better. I'm sure this is a little hard to follow for those who don't have these interests, but let's see if I can give you an example of how it might have worked if the school system had served our needs. If you will recall, in Explanation 11, the previous episode, I mentioned having a magazine confiscated from me in high school. It certainly wasn't the only one, but for the purposes of this discussion, I want to focus on that incident in particular. The magazine in question, I don't remember which one, probably Hot Rod, but it was one of the expensive ones. That meant 50 cents instead of 35 cents. Anyway, it had an article in which I was fascinated. It was about the work of a group of young Chrysler engineers who had formed a sort of club. They called themselves the Ram Chargers, and they competed at the local drag strip in Michigan, as I recall, with a 53 Plymouth coupe they called the High and Mighty. These guys were sharp and experimenting with a number of things to improve the performance of the High and Mighty at the drag strip. They were the first to discover the weight transfer advantages of raising the car's center of gravity, among other things. Of particular interest to me was the work they were doing regarding intake manifold length and size to improve horsepower. And that was the subject of the article I was reading and so rudely taken by my teacher. Up until then, this was the mid to late 50s, intake manifolds were pretty much considered to be a device to hold the carburetor and connect it via internal tunnels to the engine. Somehow, these guys suspected horsepower could be improved by working with the length, diameter, and flow characteristics of the intake manifold. It really didn't make sense to me. I was aware, even in my teens, there were only 3 ways one could increase engine power in an internal combustion engine: make it bigger, spin it faster, or force the air in. One has to think of an internal combustion engine as an air pump. The more air in and out, the more power. So, how could manipulating the design of the intake manifold extract more power from an engine? Of course, as it turned out, the Ram Chargers had indeed developed something revolutionary and is in common use today. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. So, what was it they discovered and were developing, and I was intently reading about in an unrelated class in high school? It was the beginning of what we now refer to as Ram tuning. But what was it? It seems these guys reasoned that if air was something, and it is, then when it is drawn through a tunnel, as it is during the intake stroke of an internal combustion engine, then it must develop inertia. Think of the column of air being drawn through the intake tunnel as a train, like a locomotive. It is being drawn through the tunnel at high speed when the intake valve is open and the piston is going down. Now, the question is, what happens when the intake valve closes? The train is speeding through the tunnel and suddenly faces a wall, the closed intake valve. Obviously, the train comes to a sudden stop. Are you with me so far? Now, the column of air isn't a train, which would be a solid. It is a gas, and gas, unlike a solid, is compressible. A train will stop suddenly and just stop, but a gas will compress. So, what we have is a column of air under compression piled up behind the closed intake valve. What happens? Nothing. It piles up from the energy created by inertia and then dissipates. So what? The Ram Chargers reasoned the moment the air piles up behind the closed intake valve has a time value, and imagined that for a moment there is pressure before it dissipates. If you're still with me, at this moment, we now have a closed intake valve with air pressure built up behind it, granted only for a moment. Now, what happens if we could predict when that moment occurs and when maximum compression is achieved, then time it to open the intake valve? Can you see where that would help induce air into the engine? This ramming effect is what ram tuning is all about. It sounds easy, but it isn't. Oh, it's easy mechanically. There are no moving parts or complicated mechanisms, but the physics is daunting. The column of air and the inertia it develops is a product of the length of the tunnel, its cross-section, and the speed of the air through the tunnel. The Ram Chargers were experimenting with various length and diameter intake manifolds in a successful effort to take advantage of this phenomenon. As I read the article in high school, I wondered if it violated the rule about there are only 3 ways to make an internal combustion engine develop more power. Make it bigger, spin it faster, or force the air in. And there it was. Force the air in. That's what this phenomenon can do. It's almost a trick, but it isn't. It's physics. We generally think of forcing air into an engine as supercharging, a pump, or chemically, as with nitrous oxide. But they discovered and developed a phenomenon that provided the effect of supercharging without a supercharger. It was really quite remarkable at the time and really isn't well understood, even today, except among engineers. One has to remember this moment to which I refer only occurs for a brief part of a second and isn't something you can visually see. But you have to remember, an internal combustion engine, this moment I'm describing, featuring built-up pressure behind the intake valve, occurs many times a second in a running engine. When I understood it, and I had to go out and buy another magazine to finish the article, and 50 cents was a bite at the time, it was one of those, why didn't I think of that things? Similarly, many years later, when I came to understand ground effects, why didn't I think of that? Okay, we're talking about the school system failing those of us so inclined to be interested in and understand these things. I'm telling this story to suggest a different possible outcome if our school system was working to serve the interests of the gearheads that are inevitably part of their population. Suppose instead of confiscating and not returning the magazine in question, the teacher would have held on to it and asked me to say after class at which time he or she could have asked what I was reading that I found so compelling. Perhaps the teacher might have told me I could pick up the magazine from the physics teacher after school. This may well have triggered a useful, educationally productive conversation from which I could have benefited. Now, I know this sounds like small potatoes, and viewed as an isolated incident, it is, and I certainly recovered. But as I got older and experienced many similar instances, I couldn't help but wonder how many millions of times this sort of thing happens across our country and what we might be losing in the process. Losing? Yes. One can only speculate about the number of ideas that have never come to fruition because of a lack of encouragement in our school system. The work on the local drag strip of this small group of Chrysler engineers resulted in near immeasurable increase in efficiency of the internal combustion engine, resulting in dramatic reduction of emissions and decreased fuel consumption. It's interesting to think of how many millions of gallons of gasoline were saved because of the work of the ram chargers at the local drag strip. I want to expand on this just a little bit. I do this to point out the degree of difficulty of what I'm asking of the school system. You see, in the example I've just used as an illustration, I'm suggesting a good teacher would have recognized the importance of what I was reading and taken some action to encourage my interest. Oh, I should also say, I'm not suggesting the teacher should not have been annoyed with me for not giving her class my full attention. Of course she should be annoyed, but of greater concern should have been his or her opportunity to engage with a student and perhaps do something that might be educationally productive for the student. I am suggesting this was a missed teaching moment. Again, viewed as an isolated incident, unimportant, but if it is something that occurs thousands of times a day across the country, it may explain some of the results I've observed during the past 60 years. At least it's worth talking about for a few moments. Let's suppose the teacher would have recognized the student was involved in something worthy of encouragement. What could he or she have done? In all likelihood, if the moment was spotted, the action taken would have probably been wrong. I can imagine the average teacher's instinct would have been to refer the matter to the auto shop teacher. Unfortunately, my experience with the educational system leads me to believe they are incapable of understanding the difference between someone interested in automobiles and or motorcycles as mechanic material rather than engineering material. They seem unable to separate an interest in mechanical things from the work of a mechanic. I suppose it's a difficult distinction for those not so inclined, but something I think we have a right to expect from professional educators. Trying to articulate this distinction is difficult at best, but important. When I think about the loss of lane tech, and make no mistake about it, the lane tech I experienced no longer exists. The lane tech education, as imperfect as it was, from which I still benefit some 60 years later, is gone. The lane tech that taught how knowledge and information can be turned into creation and the processes needed in this effort is gone. The only way this could have occurred is a lack of understanding of the purpose of education. Public education, in great measure, has become job training for corporations. I've said it before and I'll say it again. One shouldn't go to school to get a good job. One goes to school to be exposed to the world, its history, its present, and perhaps a glimpse at its future. Before I go any further, I should probably comment on the assertions I made earlier in this series. I said, when I graduated from high school, I was not interested in going to college. This was despite the urging from family and the school itself, who fell all over themselves to promote the notion that Lane Tech was a college preparatory school. The message was clear. Their purpose was to promote the notion that Success in life was available to those they referred to as college-bound. I wanted no part of it. I was 18 years old and ready to take on the challenges life had to offer. I had engines to build, races to run, and girls to chase. From my perspective, I'd spent enough time in classrooms. It was time to seek my destiny. There was something else, something that bothered me greatly. While I saw it as important that one generation pass on knowledge from generation to generation, I was concerned that original thought may very well be the price of this information transfer process. It has been said that indoctrination is an inevitable part of education. I was quite aware that I too was being indoctrinated. Yes, I understood that if we didn't have schools to pass on information and knowledge, every generation would have to reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, if each generation had to reinvent the wheel, we may very well, over generations, have discovered a better way to move things. Once we have been indoctrinated to accept the wheel as an answer, we look no further. There is a real danger when education becomes indoctrination, and in all likelihood, each person will have to decide at what point am I being indoctrinated or conditioned instead of educated. I'm probably going too deep into this, and I'm greatly oversimplifying, but I'm going to come back to it later, and I want to lay a little groundwork in advance. I mentioned educators easily confuse mechanics and engineering, and often miss teaching moments. In the example I laid out, ram tuning, one could easily misunderstand a young person's interest in this phenomena as an interest in changing parts on a car to improve performance, rather than those interested in why. What was going on in this apparently empty tunnel feeding a cylinder? And did the length of the tunnel make any difference? And why? Did the size of the tunnel make any difference? And why? More important to us, was it possible to damage the ram tuning effect by doing what instinct tells us to do? For example, make the tunnel bigger, longer, and straighter. Even Chrysler had to learn that while the effect did exist, was it useful? The first generation of these long intake runners lasted only a year or so. As it turned out, the 36-inch long intake length improved performance in the 2,600 RPM range, roughly. And while this was fine for highway cruising, the Chrysler engineers decided this phenomena would serve Chrysler's interests better if the tunnels were shortened to about half. This would improve performance in the 3,500 RPM range as when a person stood on the gas pedal and in passing gear engaged. If one compares the first generation long intake manifold to the second generation long intake manifold, one can easily see how Chrysler accomplished this. Look at the runners themselves. The second generation manifolds have separate runners only from the halfway point. Of course, these manifolds only lasted a few years too, because a separate problem reared its ugly head. Very few service stations understood this phenomena, and mechanics used to adjusting a single carburetor had a heck of a time servicing and adjusting two 4-barrel carburetors separated by several feet. Dealer complaints led them away from this technology, except for the high-performance 426 Chrysler Hemi that featured two 4-barrel carburetors with 11-inch long intake runners designed to increase power in the 6,000 to 8,000 RPM range. People who bought these cars were knowledgeable and willing to put up with more complicated servicing. Of course, once the engineers knew of this phenomena, they weren't about to leave it alone, and ram tuning exists in one form or another on almost all modern engine designs. In fact, a number of manufacturers have actually developed variable length intake runners to accommodate the engine demands over a wide variety of RPM ranges. Of course, they are complicated. But the important point I want to make is the origin of this idea. A group of junior Chrysler engineers, we would probably call them interns today after corporate America figured out how to use this previously medical profession only technique of getting free labor. Anyway, it was this small group of engineering-minded drag racers who called themselves the Ram Chargers, experimenting with the phenomena of ram tuning at the local drag strip with their race car, the High and Mighty. This brings me to my second point about education. I am more than a little annoyed at the school system staking out its claim as the place where one gets education, the only place. I've often wondered, while listening to a group of people talking about their educational backgrounds, some declaring Northwestern, some declaring Notre Dame, etc. I've often wondered what they thought the rest of us were doing while they sat in a classroom for 4 more years or more after high school. Did they think we turned our brains off? I have never been to a racetrack in which I didn't learn something. Not once. It didn't make any difference if it was a drag strip or an oval or a road race course. It didn't make any difference if I was a spectator or a builder or a racer. I always learned something. I've never built an engine in which I didn't learn something. I've never built a car or motorcycle or boat in which I didn't learn something. We as a culture have allowed ourselves to be conditioned to think the only place education exists is at a building with the word school emblazoned on it. And you pay money to be there. This is the only place education occurs. It's a lie, of course, but perception is reality. And if you believe it, it's so. I'm going to get into this more and more because I think it's culturally important. Remember, the auto industry, the economic engine of our country for 100 years and counting, wasn't started by a corporation or a government program or a university study. It was started by 2 guys in a garage, the Duryea brothers. The aviation industry, without which our country could not have become what we know today, wasn't started by a corporation or a government program or a university study. It was started by 2 guys in a garage, the Wright brothers. There is a point I want to make, but it'll have to wait for a moment because, as they say on commercial television, we have breaking news. This past weekend, Sunday, September 30th, 2018, the Riverside Garage Car Show was held and, as has become tradition, the annual Chris Schutz and Tom Lima Awards were presented. I explained earlier in this program what these awards are all about. Briefly, they are to ensure people who have made a contribution to the motorsport community and passed away are not forgotten. Mr. Lyle, Jerry Lockhart, sponsors these trophies. I selected the Chris Schutz Award winner and Jerry selected the Tom Lima Award winner. The idea is I pick a car I think Chris would have liked best, and Jerry picks the car he thinks Tom Lima would have liked best. We'll start with the Chris Schutz Award. The car I picked this year, I would have had to talk Chris into because I'm sure she wouldn't have known what a Studebaker Lark was. This one was special though. It's a 1962 and would have been a sleeper when Chris and I were teenagers in the late 50s and early 60s. A 2-door post car with a 327 Chevy motor and a 4-speed transmission, or as we would have said back in the day, 2-door sedan rather than post car. We also would have called the 327 small block Chevy motor a Corvette engine and a floor box. Anyway, it's owned by Jim Simmer and driven daily. Oh yes, I suppose most of you will have to look up Studebaker Lark. It was a real car. In fact, Studebaker was an Indiana company founded in 1852 as a carriage and wagon maker, probably best known for its covered wagons that helped settle the West. Studebaker began producing cars in 1903, first with electric cars, then offering both electric and gasoline cars in 1905, finally changing completely to gasoline engines shortly thereafter. That continued until their demise in 1966. In 1959, they decided to enter what was being called the compact car market with the Studebaker Lark. With compact dimensions and an economical engine, Studebaker hoped this car would keep them in business. No, they never had one with a 327 Chevy engine and a 4-speed transmission, but Jim's car looks like they should have considered it. Compact and light with plenty of interior room, it was almost what the public was looking for. Unfortunately, it was too little too late and Studebaker folded. I'll have to admit, I picked this one because I liked it, and Chris would have lit up if she'd heard it running with its Corvette V8 rumble. Congratulations on winning the 2018 Chris Schutz Award, Jim. You have a standout, extremely original, drivable street rod. Now, let's move on to the vehicle Jerry picked that he thinks Tom Lima would have liked. I said before, Tom Lima was an old school guy, and this 1949 Chevy pickup would have been right up his alley. It's owned by Sergio Infante, and I hope I'm saying that right, Sergio. Sergio Infante from Markham, Illinois. and powered by a 350 small block Chevy V8 backed up by a turbo 700 trans. This is one of those quietly exceptional vehicles Tom would have gone for. The closer you look, the more the beautifully done body modifications become apparent. Most notably, of course, is the exquisite custom interior created by Tony and Sergio's custom upholstery shop in Markham, Illinois. Congratulations, Sergio, on winning the 2018 Tom Lima Award. These awards are important to us here at Motorsports Unlimited. I've said so many times there wouldn't have been a Motorsports Unlimited if not for Chris's efforts. And Jerry Lockhart, who knew Tom Lima well, doubts if we would have so many of these fine outdoor summer car shows today if Tom hadn't blazed the trail so many years ago. Personally, I want to thank Jerry Lockhart for sponsoring these awards all these years. He looks and acts like a big, tough guy, but I've always seen right through it. He has a soft heart, and people are important to him. Chris and Tom made a positive difference in his life and the lives of everyone in the greater Chicagoland motorsport community, and I thank him for keeping their memories alive. Now, let's get back to my thoughts on the school system. I think I just mentioned, before the breaking news just presented, education doesn't just come from buildings with the word school emblazoned on them. In fact, if you keep your eyes open, education is everywhere. I'll go further. If you don't keep your eyes open, you'll never learn anything, even if you spend a lot of time in buildings with the word school emblazoned on them. I know you've been conditioned to think one can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and somehow we've forgotten the complete old saying, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. The truth is, if your kid is a dope, no amount of schooling will change that. That doesn't mean your child might not have many other fine qualities, but the fact is there are very few rocket scientists. Probably a good thing. We don't need that many. I know you've been conditioned to think if you just spend enough money on education, you can change the intellectual capability of your offspring. The truth is, it can't be done. I know of no school or school system that claims to be able to make a person one bit smarter. Of course, I haven't studied every school system in the world, so it's possible there might be one that makes the claim, and if you find one, let me know. I'll make them prove it. Despite all this, we continually hear the claim of the college-educated being worth so much more because statistics show that people with a college education on average make X amount more in their lifetime. Therefore, spend money on schools. The problem is, statistics lie, and liars always cite statistics. There's another way to look at it. If there was no such thing as college, I submit those same people who did well with a college education would have done equally well if college didn't exist. They are just plain bright people and choose to go to college. What annoys me is school systems or schools claiming the success of those folks as the work of college. It isn't true, but perception is reality, and if you believe it, it becomes truth. The fact is, at 75 years old, I've met a number of people in my life who chose not to attend college and did extremely well. They were very bright and hardworking and creative. It wasn't college that made it so. It was them. I say all these things at the risk of being misunderstood. Anyone who knows me knows how much I value education. Over the years, when I felt I needed to learn more about something, I'd seek out a school and take a course. I've always found it helpful. For example, I've been welding since I was 16 years old when I bought my first oxyacetylene tanks. I always thought I was pretty good, but I was backyard garage schooled. I just learned from the older guys. Sometime in my early 20s, I became aware some of my understanding of welding was flawed, so I took a night school class in welding. The thing I remember most was my lack of understanding of welding rod. Like most backyard welders, I often used coat hangers for welding rod. I mean, it was steel and about the right diameter, so why not? Well, the why not is coat hanger is a very poor choice for welding rod. Coat hangers have to be very stiff, to support clothes. So they are made from high carbon steel. High carbon steel is a poor choice for most welding applications because it results in a brittle weld. Now, I can't honestly say any of my welds ever broke before I learned this in school, but it was a good thing to know and added to my knowledge of welding, and I got it from school. Once again, it sounds like I'm contradicting myself. I'm not. It's just that life is complicated and you have to wait to hear the complete thought before passing judgment. So what am I saying? Am I for school or against it? I'm not saying either one. I'm trying to help you understand there is more than one side to the argument, and time is our most valuable resource and should be spent wisely. Time spent in a college classroom is time that is not spent somewhere else. It should surprise no one that everything has a cost, including time, and time allocation is critical to everyone's life. You know, let me get back to that. First, I want to make the point that I value education, but it is not a blank check. I am well aware of the argument that we all benefit from an educated society, thus we all pay for it. I, as a person who never had any children, am taxed significantly for education. Those who know me know that I've never complained about it, even when others in my position have complained bitterly about paying through the nose to educate other people's children. I'm always the first to point out we all benefit from an educated society, not just those of us who have children. It is important that we can all read and write, add and subtract, and so on. Society as we know it couldn't exist without an educated population. We all have to be able to read the street signs and understand contracts. Yes, I buy into it. And when I say buy, I mean buy. Education is by far the largest part of my tax bill. They break it down for you on your real estate tax. Education, as we know it, costs money, and we all pay for it. Even those of us who have some concerns about how much is education and how much is indoctrination. Indoctrination, yes, it's an inevitable part of education. For example, we've all pretty much heard the concept that we all benefit from an educated society. I probably heard it first in school, a concept I endorse. However, how many are aware of the other side of that argument? And that is it appropriate in a free society to force someone to pay for others to become more competitive than they are? It's an interesting question, and one that should be echoed every time the first is uttered, lest the quest for this elusive thing we all embrace because we are unaware of the other side of the argument becomes an industry. In my lifetime, I remember President Eisenhower warning us of the looming military-industrial complex. I suppose, in my own way, I'm warning of the growing education industry and its consequences. Just because we slap the word education on it, that doesn't mean that's what it is. Education, like any other entity, ought to be constantly challenged to ensure it is what it says it is and hasn't morphed into something else. I don't want to get too far off the track, but to illustrate my point about constantly keeping an eye on entities, I would point to the various religious scandals involving sexual abuse. Now, I should say I'm not religious, so I don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak. But it's a good example of entities morphing into something they are not, if not constantly monitored. In the case of religion, here we have an entity or entities composed of well-meaning, dedicated people who I am sure mostly do good work. Unfortunately, if left unchallenged, becomes breeding grounds for the ne'er-do-wells to ply their evil intentions. Once we establish something as being all good or unimpeachable, it is ripe for the ne'er-do-wells or even the ethically challenged to move in and take advantage. The same can be said for education. Excessive spending for education is as potentially dangerous as excessive spending for the military. Perhaps I should explain. Military spending is an attractive place for leaders to appropriate money, and it's rarely questioned, and there's a reason for that. Being safe costs money. How safe do you want to be? It's the same argument as motorsports. Going fast costs money. How fast do you want to go? The argument holds up until you realize you are starving and spend all of your resources on the military. Dead from starvation is just as dead from enemy attack. I suppose what I'm trying to say in my own cute little way is, for those who are sharp, hardworking, and creative, success, regardless of how you measure it, is assured. If you're not, no amount of schooling, regardless of cost, will change it. What it will do is impoverish you and perhaps your family for decades to come. And Worse yet, you may have missed other educational opportunities. Remember what I said earlier. Time spent in a college classroom is time not spent somewhere else that might have benefited you. Speaking for myself, I can't think of any block of time in my life I would have been willing to surrender to sit in a classroom. Looking back from my current vantage point, I can't think of a part of my life I didn't think was important and educational. Again, I meant what I said earlier. Education is all around you. Learning is a continuous process and doesn't just come from a place with the word school on it. Certainly, I know people have been conditioned to think school is the only vendor of education, and I'll concede it provides a convenient way to demonstrate your acquired knowledge. I mean, it even provides you with a piece of paper so you can prove your educational content. It's not a bad process. One goes to school to learn, then learns in part. School is the only place one can get that education. Then, after putting you in debt for decades to come, they give you a piece of paper to indicate you are, in fact, educated. All around you, this process is supported. Television has no shortage of programs designed to illustrate the value of the process. From sitcoms to dramas, the idyllic American lifestyle is displayed. Young people going off to college where they inevitably meet someone from the opposite sex and form a union that results in offspring who go through the school system, then go off to college where they inevitably meet someone. You get the idea. It's an endless cycle. What isn't mentioned is the incredible debt with which each generation is inevitably burdened. What is mentioned is what your entertainment should be. From school to school, one is treated to teams. Football teams, baseball teams, basketball teams, and all the rest. One learns the appropriateness of rooting for the school's team, wearing the school colors. In short, one learns tribalism. Hey, it had to come from somewhere. I step forward to suggest it's inherent in the modern school system. One can't possibly spend some 12 to 20 of their most impressionable years in the school system without being influenced by it. Between television and the school system, I'm not surprised people think sports is football, baseball, basketball, et al. What does surprise me is that people haven't caught on to what is going on. One is forced to question the notion of educated society. What is educated about not noticing one has been conditioned? I can't believe no one else has noticed the mindless tribalism, both in sports and politics, among other things. Tribalism isn't something someone learns. It's something someone is conditioned to accept. What is educated about mindlessly following a political party or a sports team? Yes, they are one and the same. It's a peculiar behavior that has infected our society. We follow sports teams because they are our team, whatever that means. I mean, we don't own them, nor do they provide for us, but somehow they are ours. Mindless. The same goes for political parties. We support our party. Again, whatever that means. They somehow represent our interests without any evidence of it. Mindless. Where does it come from? This mindless allegiance to something in which we have no return. I would suggest the school system plays a major role in conditioning us to behave in this fashion. Just because we attend a school doesn't mean we have an obligation to sing their praises. I live in the Chicago area. Teachers are well-paid professionals with enviable pension plans. They are not doing us any favors. Organizing things like pep rallies to create enthusiasm for school activities from which they, the school, not you, benefit seems to have nothing to do with education and everything to do with indoctrination. Yes, it is possible to spend time in a classroom that can damage you. In many ways, college is in the business of turning out cogs for the machinery of industry. I felt the pressure of conformity when I was in high school and wanted no further processing. It seemed to me, if one spent a significant part of their life in school, they may never be capable of original thought. You know, as I look over what I'm telling you, it becomes clear to me there is no way I won't be misunderstood. It's impossible. It sounds like I'm against education, and nothing could be further from the truth. Those who know me know how much I value knowledge. How many years before the age of the computer I spent at the local library several times a week. Even my interest in the computer reveals my interest in knowledge. I mean, I spend many hours at the computer nearly every day, yet I have no idea how to get to Facebook or chat rooms or any other social media. My enthusiasm for the computer is centered around the reality that all of the knowledge in the world is readily available at my fingertips, in my home. What a treasure. No, I don't oppose knowledge. I oppose what we call our school system and what it has become, the education industry. I oppose what our education has morphed into. I oppose our education system having become a major competitor in the sports entertainment marketplace, and they do it without apology to those they hurt. I have yet to hear a voice from so-called learned institutions questioning this blatant commercialism while operating under the tax-supported umbrella of 501c3. And while I'm wondering, where is the IRS in this? Unfortunately, this is a deep, complicated subject, and our hour is almost up for this week, and I still have to try to get a little classic Motorsports Unlimited action footage in the program so you don't forget what show you're watching. Just one more thought to ponder. Where are the learned voices from the depths of this sewer we call an education system when they become aware they are participants in something that yields graduate students who can't read and pays their football coach $5 million a year? Forget voices. What are their actions? I question their ethics. Laura?
Getting my second thoughts about this.
You're getting second thoughts about this?
Rodney, you're going to promise me. I don't even want a long ride like Denise had. I just want to come up and come down. Okay. Be a starlet.
There you go.
Who's behind these shades? Hey, good luck. Oh.
What do you think, Lynn? This is your friend. You're responsible for bringing her to us.
She's going to kill me tomorrow.
And in a moment, I bet she's screaming right now. I wish we had like a wireless mic we could have on the girls while you guys are up there.
Don't ask me.
Come on, Laura.
No. I didn't open my eyes at all.
I hope that was enough action footage for John Platania, who comes to the studio every Wednesday night to help me. Me? I'm Bill Wildt, and I'll pick up on this subject next time.
This program made possible in part by support from ABC Auto Parts, located on Ashland Avenue at 138th Street in Blue Island, Illinois.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Jimmy's Red Hots, located on Grant Avenue and Pulaski Road in Chicago.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think. Now, this is not one of our usual next weeks promoting next week's program. This is a reminder that Motorsports Unlimited is now global on YouTube. Simply subscribe to Bill Wildt Motorsports Unlimited on YouTube and watch us anytime.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.